The sound of my fiance's voice where it shouldn't have been was the first crack in the foundation of my life. I was standing in the hallway of my childhood home, my overnight bag still clutched in my hand, the scent of my mother's lavender, polish thick in the air. I had come to surprise her for her birthday, but the surprise was mine. Mark's car, a vintage convertible he cherished more than anything, was parked discreetly behind the house. He was supposed to be in Singapore, closing a deal, and the voice I heard from behind the closed study door was not the warm, loving tone of the man I was going to marry. It was a cold, sharp, conspiratorial whisper. "The timeline is too slow, Eleanor," he said. "We need to accelerate the plan. Before she starts asking questions about the trust, the wedding has to happen before the end of the quarter." My relationship with my mother, Eleanor, had always been a quiet, complex dance of love and misunderstanding. She was a woman of quiet, old-world elegance, a woman who valued tradition and stability above all else. I was a creature of the new world, a software developer who had built a successful app from a string of code and a dream in my tiny city apartment. She was proud of my success, but in a distant, slightly bewildered way, as if she were admiring a strange, exotic bird she couldn't quite comprehend. She had always wanted a more traditional life for me, a stable marriage to a man from a good family, which is why Mark was such a godsend. He was the bridge between our two worlds. He was a charismatic, ambitious investment banker who understood my drive, but he also came from the kind of quiet, old money family that Eleanor revered. He was the perfect man, the perfect son-in-law. When he proposed with a simple, elegant diamond that was as understated and as confident as he was, I felt that I had finally completely earned my mother's approval. Our engagement seemed to thaw a decade of quiet frost between us. The plan was for a small, elegant wedding in 6 months. Mark was in the middle of launching a new international fund, a deal that required extensive travel. He was supposed to be in Singapore for 2 weeks. I had decided on a whim to use his absence to surprise my mother for her 60th birthday. I drove the 3 hours from the city to her beautiful, rambling home in the countryside, my heart filled with a light, happy anticipation, seeing his car. A lovingly restored 1960s convertible, tucked away behind the garage, was the first jarring note. My mind immediately scrambled for a logical explanation. He had come back early to surprise me, perhaps. He had conspired with my mother to create a double surprise. But that didn't feel right. Mark was a man of meticulous planning. A change of this magnitude, cutting a multi-million-dollar business. Trip short was not his style. I let myself in with my old key. The house was silent. "Mom?" I called out, my voice a little too loud in the stillness. No answer. I walked through the familiar rooms, my unease growing with every step. I was heading towards the back of the house when I heard their voices from behind the closed door of my late father's study. I pressed my ear to the cold, heavy wood. The words were muffled, but the tone was clear. It was cold, clinical, and utterly devoid of the warmth and affection they both always showed me. Double quotes. It single quotes. "It's too risky a wait," Mark was saying. "Her father's lawyers are already asking about the annual trust report. If they start digging before I have control, the whole thing could unravel." "I'm handling the lawyers," my mother's voice replied, sharp and impatient. "Your job is to handle my daughter. You were supposed to have this settled by now, Mark. That was our agreement. Your daughter is not as naive as you think," he shot back. "She's asking questions about the portfolio. She wants to see the prenuptial agreement. I keep putting her off, but she's persistent. Have you ever had a moment where you feel like you're floating outside your own body, watching a scene from a movie?" The words I was hearing were so monstrous, so completely at odds with the reality I knew, that my brain couldn't process them. It was like listening to 2 beloved characters from my favorite book suddenly start speaking in a demonic language. The betrayal was so profound, it felt like a violation of the laws of physics. "The prenup is a non-starter," my mother said. "It has to be a clean marriage, full commingling of assets. It's the only way to trigger the transfer of control clause in the trust. You know this? Your job is to be the charming, loving fiancé and get her to the altar with no questions asked. My job is to manage the estate. Don't forget your place in this, Mark." The condescension in her voice was chilling. She was speaking to the man I was going to marry as if he were a hired employee. An employee hired to do a job. And that job was me. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to grip the wall to keep from falling. My trust fund. It was a significant one, left to me by my father, a quiet, brilliant artist who had died when I was a teenager. My mother was the executor, managing it until I turned 30 or until I married. I was 29. The wedding, I now realized, was not just a celebration. It was a deadline. I couldn't listen anymore. I pushed the door open. The sight of them will be burned into my memory forever. They were standing on opposite sides of my father's oak desk, a stack of financial documents spread between them. They looked like two generals planning a campaign, not a mother and her future son-in-law. They snapped their heads towards me, their faces a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. "Clara." My mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest, her face instantly transforming, the cold conspirator replaced by the flustered, surprised mother. "Darling, what are you doing here?" "You're early." Mark recovered faster. He plastered on his signature, charming smile, a smile that now looked grotesque and predatory. "Sweetheart," he said, walking towards me, his arms outstretched. "I came back early. I wanted to surprise you for your mom's birthday. We were just going over the wedding budget." The lie was so audacious, so insulting to my intelligence, that it gave me a strange, cold clarity. "The wedding budget?" I said, my voice dangerously quiet. It sounded like you were discussing a hostile takeover, and I believe I was the target. "Company." The smile on Mark's face faltered. My mother's face went pale. They saw the look in my eyes. They saw that I had heard. "Now, Clara, you're overwrought," my mother began, her voice taking on the soothing, patronizing tone she always used when I was being emotional. "You've misunderstood. Mark was just here to formally ask for my blessing. It was all very traditional." The tradition where the suitor discusses the transfer of control clause in his fiancée's trust. I shot back. I must have missed that chapter in the etiquette books. They had no answer. They just stood there, two guilty conspirators, their perfect, beautiful lie shattered on the floor between us. I looked from my mother's panicked face to the cold, calculating eyes of the man I had promised to spend my life with. The grief, the heartbreak, it would come later. In that moment, all I felt was a profound, chilling sense of betrayal and a single burning question: why? That night, I pretended to accept their flimsy, patched-together story of a misunderstanding. I played the part of the tired, emotional daughter, too exhausted from my trip to argue. They were relieved, believing they had contained the damage. But as I lay in my childhood bed, the familiar scent of lavender now feeling like a lie, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard my mother's footsteps in the hallway. I crept to my door and listened as she spoke in a hushed, frantic whisper on the phone in the kitchen. "He's here," she was saying to someone, "David's son. He's asking questions. He says the timeline is compromised. We need to accelerate the plan. We have to get to the journals before he does." David, my father's name. But my father didn't have a son. I was his only child. The lie was a living, breathing entity in the house. The next morning, my mother and Mark moved around me with a cloying, suffocating concern, their every word a carefully chosen brick in the wall they were trying to rebuild around me. They treated me like a patient recovering from a fever dream, a woman whose own ears had deceived her. But the name I had overheard in the dead of night echoed in my mind. David's son? My father, a quiet, introverted artist, had no other family to speak of. He had been an only child, his parents long gone. He had no son. I was his only legacy. The woman I called my mother was not just lying to me about money. She was lying to me about the very foundation of my life, about the man I had worshipped. In memory since I was a child, I spent the next 2 days playing the part of the dutiful, apologetic daughter. I told them I had been overworked, that I had overreacted. I let them believe their deception had worked. It was one of the hardest things I have ever had to do. Every smile I gave Mark felt like a betrayal of myself. Every hug from my mother felt like the embrace of a snake, but I knew it was my only chance. I had to stay inside the conspiracy to understand it. While they were busy congratulating themselves on their successful damage control, I began my own silent investigation, the journals. My father had been a prolific journaler. He had filled dozens of beautiful leather-bound books with his sketches, his thoughts on art, his observations of the world. They were my most prized possession, a direct connection to the father I had lost so young. My mother kept them in a locked, glass-fronted bookcase in the study, the very room where I had overheard her and Mark plotting. She said she was preserving them. I now realized she was guarding them. I waited until they both left the house, on a manufactured errand to the city to pick up wedding invitations. I knew they were really meeting with lawyers, with co-conspirators. The moment their car was gone, I went to the study. The bookcase was locked as expected, but I had grown up in this house. I knew its secrets. I knew that my father, a man who loved puzzles, had hidden a spare key in a hollowed-out book on the top shelf, a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. My hands trembled as I unlocked the case. The journals were all there, a neat row of worn leather. Spines. I started with the last one, the one he was writing in the year he died. I flipped through the familiar pages of sketches and notes. It all seemed normal, but then I found it. Tucked into the back pocket of the journal was a small folded envelope. Inside was a key, not to a door, but to a safety deposit box. And a single cryptic note in my father's handwriting. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, it means the world is not as it seems. There are stories I never had the courage to tell you. Some truths are too heavy for a child to bear. But you are not a child anymore. The key is to box 734 at the National Bank. The truth is in the work. Always look at the work. I love you, Dad. Have you ever felt the ground beneath your feet shift, not with a violent earthquake, but with a slow, silent, terrifying certainty? My father, the simple, gentle artist, had been keeping a secret so profound he had to hide its key in a locked box, in a locked case, in a locked room. The man I thought I knew was a stranger, just like the man I thought I was going to marry. The truth is in the work. His paintings. My father's art was the one thing my mother had never been able to control. After his death, his work had been discovered, and he had become a posthumous art world sensation. My mother had managed his estate, selling his paintings for vast sums, creating the very trust that she and Mark were now trying to steal. She had always told me she was honoring his legacy. I now suspected she was profiting from it in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. I took the key and a single, small painting from the wall of the study. It was a piece I had always loved, a dark, moody landscape of the Maine coastline. My mother had always hated it, calling it depressing. I had a feeling its secrets were not on the surface. I drove to the city, to the National Bank. I used the key and a copy of my father's death certificate to access the box. The bank manager, a kind, elderly woman who remembered my father, looked at me with sad, sympathetic eyes. Your father was a wonderful man, she said. So talented, but so troubled. The box was not filled with money or legal documents. It was filled with my father's real journals. Not the curated, edited versions that were in the bookcase at home, but the raw, uncensored originals. And it contained a series of letters. Letters between my father, David, and another man, a man named Thomas Alistair. I sat in the cold, sterile viewing room of the bank and I began to read. And the carefully constructed museum of my life was not just cracked. It was bulldozed to the ground. The man I knew as my father, David, was not a simple artist. He was one of the most brilliant art forgers of his generation. He and his partner, Thomas Alistair, were a legendary, infamous duo. Thomas was the historian, the expert who could create flawless provenances, the fake histories for their forged masterpieces. David was the artist, the genius who could replicate the hand of a Renaissance master with an almost supernatural skill. They had created dozens of forgeries, sold for millions to unsuspecting collectors and museums. The letters were a detailed account of their last, most audacious project, the forging of a lost masterpiece by the 17th century painter Vermeer. It was their magnum opus, the one that would allow them to retire, but something had gone wrong. The buyer, a ruthless, anonymous collector known only as the Patron, had discovered the forgery. He wasn't angry, he was impressed. But he was also a blackmailer. He had forced them into a terrible bargain. They would work for him exclusively, creating a collection of perfect forgeries, or he would expose them to the world. My father, a man who, at his core, loved art, was horrified. He had been a thief, but he had a code. He refused. And that refusal had cost him his life. The sudden illness he had died from was no illness at all. The letters made it clear. The patron had him silenced, a quiet, untraceable murder to protect. His secrets. Imagine discovering that the person you worshipped as a saint was, in fact, a brilliant, charismatic criminal. The grief is a strange, twisted thing. I was mourning my father all over again, but this time, I was mourning a man I had never known, a man of immense talent and profound, tragic flaws. He wasn't the simple artist my mother had described. He was a fallen angel, a man who had flown too close to the sun and had been burned. And my mother, she had known. She had known everything. The journals revealed that she was not just his wife. She was his accomplice. She had managed the money, laundered the profits through a series of shell corporations, and helped to create the illusion of the struggling artist. His death had not been a tragedy for her. It had been a business opportunity. She had taken his real brilliant forgeries, passed them off as his own original masterpieces, and built his posthumous fame and her fortune on that lie. The trust fund she was so desperate to control was not just my inheritance. It was a dragon's hoard of stolen, illicit money. The final piece of the puzzle was the most devastating. A single signed affidavit from Thomas Alistair, David's partner. It detailed everything, and it revealed the identity of David's son. He wasn't David's son at all. He was Thomas's son, a young, ambitious investment banker who had recently discovered the truth about his own father's past. A man who was now trying to reclaim his father's share of the stolen fortune. A man named Mark Dot, my fiancé, was not a stranger my mother had hired. He was the son of my father's murdered partner, and their alliance was not one of convenience. It was a conspiracy, a second-generation criminal enterprise designed to consolidate the fortune their parents had stolen together. My marriage was not just a means to an end. It was the final brutal act of a crime that had begun before I was even born. I sat in the vault, the truth a cold, heavy weight in my lap. My entire life was a forgery, a masterpiece of deception painted by the three people I had trusted most in the world. I looked at the small painting I had brought with me, the one my mother hated. The truth is in the work. I thought of the new high-tech X-ray and spectrography equipment at my company's R&D lab. I suddenly understood. The painting wasn't just a painting. It was a confession. It was the forged Vermeer, the masterpiece that had cost my father his life. And hidden beneath the layers of oil and canvas, I had a feeling I would find the final, damning piece of evidence I needed to destroy them all. The signature of the man who had ordered my father's death. The true identity of the patron. The drive back from the bank was a journey through a foreign country, a landscape I had once called my life, now rendered unrecognizable by the truth. I was not the daughter of a simple, beloved artist. I was the daughter of a master forger, a brilliant criminal. My mother was not a grieving widow. She was a co-conspirator, the cold, calculating CEO of a fraudulent empire. And my fiancé, the man I had loved and trusted, was the son of my father's murdered partner. A second-generation predator who saw me not as a woman to be loved, but as an asset to be acquired. I clutched the small, dark painting on the seat beside me. It was a forgery of a Vermeer, the masterpiece that had cost my father his life. And I knew with a chilling certainty that it was now my only weapon. I returned to my mother's house, but it was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, a museum of lies, and I was its new, unwilling curator. I had to play my part. I told my mother and Mark that my trip to the city had been a much-needed break. I feigned a renewed, if fragile, belief in their story of a misunderstanding. I let them believe I was still the docile, trusting Clara, the woman who could be easily managed. Their relief was palpable. They saw a problem that had been contained, a crisis averted. They had no idea that the real crisis was just beginning. There is a strange, cold power in knowing the truth when everyone around you is living a lie. It's like being the only sober person at a drunken party. You see the clumsiness, the desperation, the pathetic self-deception with a painful, crystalline clarity. I looked at my mother and my fiancé, and I no longer saw the two people I loved most in the world. I saw two clumsy, desperate criminals, and I felt nothing but a profound, chilling pity. My company, Innovate, had a state-of-the-art R&D lab, a place filled with technology that could see through almost anything. I told Mark one had a critical software bug that required my personal attention at the office. It was the perfect excuse. He was so focused on the prize of my trust fund that he was happy to have me distracted by my little tech projects. That night, I took the painting to my lab. My head of R&D, a brilliant, fiercely loyal woman named Dr. Urice Thorne, was the only person in the world I trusted. I didn't tell her the whole story. I just told her that I had acquired a painting with a questionable provenance and that I needed her to conduct a deep layer analysis. I needed her to look for what wasn't supposed to be there. For 2 days, we subjected the painting to every non-invasive test imaginable. X-ray fluorescence, infrared reflectography, multispectral imaging. We peeled back the layers of time, of oil and varnish, searching for my father's final hidden message. The first thing we found was the forgery itself. The analysis confirmed that the pigments, the canvas, the very crackler of the paint surface were a masterpiece of deception. My father had been a genius, a man who could not just replicate a master's hand, but could replicate his soul. But it was what was underneath that took my breath away. Hidden beneath the top layer of the Vermeer forgery was another painting, a completely different image, painted by my father in his own unique style. It was a portrait of a man I had never seen before, a man with cold, dead eyes and a cruel, thin-lipped smile. And beneath that portrait, in a layer of lead-based paint that was almost invisible to a standard X-ray, was a signature, not Vermeer's. Not my father's. It was a single stylized initial, a P. A ghost in the machine, a secret hidden in plain sight. My father had known he was in danger. He had known his work was about to become his death sentence. And so he had turned his final masterpiece into a confession. He had painted a portrait of his own killer and buried it beneath the surface of the lie he had been forced to create. It was a final desperate act of a brilliant mind, a message in a bottle thrown into the sea of time, in the hope that one day someone would find it. P. Who is the patron? Who is the ruthless, anonymous collector with the initial P, who had the power to make a man like my father disappear? The answer, I suspected, was in the one place I had not yet looked, my mother's carefully managed financial records for my father's estate. She had given me limited access over the years, but I knew there was a deeper level, a set of private ledgers she kept in a locked safe in the study. Getting into that safe was my next challenge. I knew the combination had to be something personal, something my father would have known. I tried his birthday, my birthday, their anniversary. Nothing. Then I remembered his note. The truth is in the work. I thought of his paintings, of the titles he had chosen, and then I remembered one. His first major sale, the one that had supposedly launched his career. It was a painting of a lone lighthouse on the Maine coast. He had titled it Eleanor's Light, after my mother. But the painting was officially cataloged under a number 7198, the date of their first meeting. July 1st, 1998, I went to the safe. I entered the numbers. The heavy steel door clicked open. Inside were the real ledgers. Not the sanitized versions she showed the accountants, but the raw, detailed records of every transaction, every shell corporation, every offshore account. And as I flipped through the pages, I saw a name, a recurring payment that was listed. Not as a sale, but as a consultancy fee. A massive multi-million-dollar payment made every year from a powerful international corporation, Preston Global. The CEO and founder of Preston Global was a man named Alistair Preston. A man known for his ruthless business practices, his vast private art collection, and his well-known obsessive quest to acquire a lost Vermeer. A man whose first initial was P. I had found him. I had found the patron. I had found my father's killer. But the most sickening discovery was yet to come. The ledgers showed that the payments from Preston Global had not stopped after my father's death. They had continued. They had continued every year, paid directly to my mother. She hadn't just known about my father's work. She hadn't just managed. The money. After his death, after he had been silenced for refusing to continue his work for Preston, she had made a new deal. She had taken over the business. She had been supplying Preston with a steady stream of her husband's brilliant forgeries for the past 15 years. She wasn't just an accomplice. She was the heir to the criminal empire. I sat on the floor of the study, surrounded by the proof of my mother's monstrous, decades-long betrayal. My fiancé Mark was not her partner in crime. He was her new recruit, the muscle she had brought in to handle the final, messy business of cutting me out and consolidating her power. My marriage was not a means to an inheritance. It was a corporate merger designed to absorb the last remaining asset, me, and ensure the continuation of the criminal enterprise. I heard a car pull into the driveway. It was them returning from another one of their wedding planning errands. They were coming back to the scene of their crime, to the house where the evidence of their entire monstrous lie was spread out on the floor around me. And I knew with a sudden terrifying clarity that they could not afford to let me walk out of this room alive. The sound of the front door opening was a death knell. I was trapped in the study, the secret ledgers spread around me like the wreckage of a plane crash. In seconds, they would be here. My mother, the secret queen of a criminal empire, and my fiancé, her newly crowned prince. My mind, the logical, problem-solving mind of a tech CEO, raced through the variables. There was no escape route. There was no weapon. My only chance of survival was to do the one thing they would never expect. I did not hide the ledgers. I did not try to run. I simply stood up, walked to the door of the study, and opened it, a calm, welcoming smile on my face. "There you are," I said, my voice a perfect imitation of cheerful relief. "I was just making tea. And I think it's time we had a real conversation about my inheritance." My calm demeanor was a calculated gambit, and it worked. It threw them completely off balance. They had expected to return to a house where the docile, ignorant Clara was waiting. The sight of me, standing calmly at the door of the study there, Forbidden's room with a knowing smile on my face, was a scenario they had not prepared for. "What are you talking about?" my mother asked, her eyes darting from my face to the open safe behind me. I saw a flicker of pure, cold panic in her eyes before she masked it with a look of maternal concern. "I've been doing some reading," I said, gesturing towards the open ledgers on the floor. "And I have to say, Mom, I'm impressed. The complexity of your financial arrangements, the sheer audacity of it all. It's brilliant. My father was a genius, but you're a visionary." I was praising her for her crimes, admiring her monstrosity. It was the one reaction they could not have anticipated. Mark just stared at me, his handsome face a mask of confusion. My mother, however, was a more skilled player. She recovered quickly. "Clara, darling, you've been under so much stress," she said, her voice dripping with a false syrupy concern. "You're not making any sense. You shouldn't be in here. These are just old, complicated business papers." "Oh, I think I'm making perfect sense," I replied, walking back into the study and picking up one of the ledgers. "For example, I've just learned that my trust fund isn't just an inheritance. It's the primary money laundering vehicle for the entire Preston Global account. And my marriage to Mark isn't just a marriage. It's the final step in transferring control of that vehicle to a new generation of management." I looked at Mark. "Congratulations on the promotion, by the way. There is a moment in every negotiation when the power shifts. It's a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the atmosphere of the room. In that moment, the power shifted. They had been the hunters, and I had been the prey. But now, I was the one holding the map of their entire world. They were no longer in control. I was. The game had changed, and they knew it. The pretense of the loving family dissolved, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a business negotiation gone wrong. "What do you want, Clara?" my mother asked, her voice now stripped of all maternal warmth. It was the voice of a CEO addressing a hostile shareholder. "I want what's mine," I said simply. "But not in the way you think. I don't want the money. It's blood money stained with my father's death. I want something far more valuable. I want the truth, and I want my freedom." I laid out my terms. They were simple. They would walk away. They would dissolve the trust, transferring the clean assets, the money that was not tied to the forgery enterprise, to a charity of my choosing. They would sign a full confession, a detailed account of their crimes, to be held in trust by my lawyer and released to the authorities if any harm ever came to me. In exchange, I would give them the one thing they valued more than money, a head start. I would give them 24 hours to disappear before I released the evidence of my father's murder to the world. Mark looked tempted. He was a pragmatist, a man who knew how to cut his losses, but my mother was a queen who would rather burn her kingdom to the ground than surrender her throne. She laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You have nothing, you foolish girl," she sneered. "You have a few old books and a wild story. Who is going to believe you? Me, the respected philanthropist, or my hysterical, unstable daughter?" "I think Alistair Preston might believe me," I said quietly, "especially when I show him this." I walked over to the wall where the dark, moody painting of the Maine coastline hung. I took it down. "I had this analyzed, Mom," I said. "My father was a genius. He painted a portrait of his own killer and hid it under another painting. A man with cold, dead eyes and the initial P for Preston signed beneath it. And I have a feeling that when the world's foremost art experts get a look at this, they're going to be very interested in the story it tells. A story about a lost Vermeer, a murdered artist, and a very, very valuable private collection." The blood drained from her face. I had found her checkmate. The painting was the one piece of evidence she didn't know existed. It was the one variable she hadn't controlled. The greatest weakness of a narcissist is their inability to believe that anyone else could be as clever as they are. My mother had underestimated me my entire life. She saw me as a soft, sentimental child who had inherited none of her ruthless pragmatism. She never imagined that I had inherited something far more powerful. My father's brilliant, creative, and puzzle-loving mind. You have 24 hours, I said, my voice cold and final. The clock starts now. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I sat in the study, the ledgers and the painting my only companions, and I waited. I didn't know if they would run or if they would try something else, something more permanent. The next morning, they were gone. They had packed a few bags and disappeared in the night, like the common criminals they were. On the kitchen table, they had left a single signed document, a full power of attorney, giving me complete control over all of my mother's assets, including the trust. It was not a confession. It was not an apology. It was a final, desperate act of self-preservation, a bribe to buy my silence. But I wasn't interested in their money. I was interested in justice. My first call was to my lawyer. My second was to a man my father had mentioned in his journals, a man at Interpol who specialized in stolen art. I told him I had a story to tell, a story about a lost firmware and a man named Alistair Preston. The war was not over, but I had survived the battle. I had taken back control of my life, and now I was ready to reclaim my father's. The news that my mother and Mark had been arrested and were now singing like canaries to save themselves should have felt like a victory, but instead it felt like a trap. I was in a sterile conference room in Geneva, the Interpol agents looking at me with a newfound predatory interest. I had come to them as a witness, a victim seeking justice for her father. But in the cold, hard calculus of international law enforcement, I was now something far more valuable. I was leverage. The agent's next words confirmed my fear. Alistair Preston is a ghost, he said, his eyes gleaming. But you are the one thing that can draw him out into the open. He doesn't know that we know about you. He just knows that the Halley ledgers have surfaced. He will come for you to silence the last remaining loose end. And when he does, we will be waiting. I refused. I told the agents that I had given them the evidence, that my part in this was done. I would not be a tethered goat in their tiger hunt. I walked out of that office against their strong advice, and I disappeared. I used the skills my mother had inadvertently taught me, the knowledge of shell corporations, of untraceable accounts, of how to move through the world without leaving a footprint. I became a ghost, just like Preston. For the next 6 months, I lived in the shadows. I moved through Europe from one small, anonymous town to another, always looking over my shoulder. I was being hunted not just by Preston's organization, but by the very law enforcement agencies that were supposed to be protecting me. I was a woman without a country, without a home, without a name, but I was not idle. I had the one thing that no one else did. I had my father's mind. I had his journals, his notes, his understanding of the art world's dark underbelly. And I had the painting, the forged vermeer, which I kept with me at all times. A dangerous, priceless secret. I began my own quiet, methodical hunt. I used my tech skills to create a new encrypted identity. I began to move through the shadowy world of high-end art auctions and private sales, not as a buyer, but as a whisper. I started a blog, an anonymous encrypted site called The Forger's Daughter. On it, I began to publish small, tantalizing details from my father's journals, not enough to expose the whole conspiracy, but enough to create a tremor in the art world. I wrote about the chemical composition of 17th century pigments, about the subtle tells of a forged provenance, about the rumors of a lost vermeer. I was creating a buzz, a story. I was baiting the trap myself, but on my own terms. There is a strange, exhilarating freedom in having nothing left to lose. The fear doesn't vanish, but it becomes a tool, a source of focus and clarity. I was no longer the grieving daughter or the betrayed fiancée. I was a hunter, and I found that I was very, very good at it. My father had taught me how to see the secrets hidden in a painting. My mother had taught me how to navigate the world of lies. And Mark had taught me the most valuable lesson of all. Never, ever underestimate your opponent. A message came through a secure channel on my blog. It was from a user who called himself the curator. He said he had been following my work. He said he represented a private collector of immense resources who was very interested in acquiring the lost vermeer I had been alluding to. He wanted to arrange a meeting. It was him. It was Preston. He was taking the bait. I agreed. I named the time and the place. A public, crowded, and yet deeply significant location. The Grand Hall of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, home to some of the world's greatest masterpieces, including several real Vermeers. I told him to come alone. I told him to come to the one place where his power and his money meant nothing, a place where the only currency was the authenticity of the art on the walls. The day of the meeting, I was terrified, but I was also filled with a cold, calm sense of purpose. I was not just avenging my father anymore. I was defending his art, his genius. I arrived early. I wasn't carrying the painting. That would have been foolish. Instead, I carried a small, high-resolution tablet, and I was not alone. I had made one final anonymous call to the Interpol agent from Geneva. I told him the time and the place. I told him I was going to give him Preston, but it had to be on my terms. I saw him across the Grand Hall, Alistair Preston. He was an older, impeccably dressed man who moved with an air of quiet, absolute power. He looked like a patron of the arts, not a murderer. He saw me, and we walked towards each other, two predators meeting in a neutral territory. "You've been a difficult woman to find, Miss Hawley," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured purr. "I've been busy," I replied, reading my father's work. "He was a genius," Preston said, a flicker of genuine admiration in his cold eyes. "A tragic, foolish genius. He didn't understand that great art isn't for the masses. It's for those who can truly appreciate it and protect it." "Is that what you call murder? Protection?" He smiled, a thin, bloodless smile. "I call it a business expense." He broke a contract. "Now, do you have the painting, or are we just here to discuss philosophy?" "I have something better," I said. I held up the tablet. On the screen was the X-ray image of the painting, showing the hidden portrait of him, the signature beneath it, clear as day. "I have the proof. And I have the original painting, which I will turn over to the authorities the moment you are in custody." He looked at the image, and for the first time, I saw a crack in his perfect, powerful facade. He had been outmaneuvered. "What do you want?" he hissed. "Money? Name your price." "I already have money," I said. "My father was a very successful criminal, after all. No, I want something else. I want a confession, and I want my father's name cleared." I slid a second device across the table, a small digital recorder. "You will tell me everything," I said. "How you found him, how you blackmailed him, how you had him killed. You will give me the names of everyone involved. And in exchange, I will give you the one thing my mother and Mark couldn't, the location of his other forgeries, the ones not in the ledger, the ones that could still ruin you. You give me his justice, and I'll let you protect your other secrets." He stared at me, his mind calculating, weighing the odds. He saw the cold, unwavering resolve in my eyes. He saw the daughter of the man he had destroyed, and he knew I would not back down. He picked up the recorder and began to speak as his story, the full, ugly truth of my father's final years, spilled out. I saw the Interpol agents, disguised as tourists, begin to close in. They had been listening to the entire conversation. When he was finished, he looked at me, a look of pure, defeated hatred in his eyes. "Now," he said, "the other forgeries, where are they?" "There are no other forgeries," I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. My father was a thief, but he was an artist first. He never would have created a weapon that could be used against him. That was a lie, my lie. In that moment, the agents moved in. "Alistair Preston," the lead agent said, his voice calm and final. "You're under arrest." As they led him away, a ghost finally being dragged into the light, I stood up. My work was done. I had avenged my father. I had dismantled a criminal empire, and I had done it on my own terms. I walked out of the museum and into the cool Amsterdam air. I thought of my mother and Mark, who would spend decades in prison, their betrayal, their ultimate undoing. I thought of my father, the brilliant, tragic forger, and I hoped that somewhere his soul was finally at peace. I had my life back, but it wasn't the life I had before. The old blueprint was gone forever. I had no desire to return to the world of tech startups and boardrooms. I had a new purpose. I used the clean portion of my inheritance to start a foundation in my father's real name, David Hall, the Hall Foundation. It was dedicated to a strange niche specialty, the use of technology in art authentication. We funded research, we developed new techniques, we worked with museums around the world to identify forgeries and reclaim stolen art. I was using my skills, my inheritance, and my father's complicated legacy to protect the very thing he had, both loved and betrayed. I was no longer just the forger's daughter. I was his legacy, a legacy not of crime, but of truth. And my life, once a perfect, beautiful lie, had finally become a messy, complicated, and authentic masterpiece of my own making.